Joel, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Welcome yourself to my humble little room here.
Well, we have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to dive right in. And I want to start with where you grew up initially.
I grew up in the heart of rock and roll. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. My youth was the east side of Cleveland, and I was exposed to a lot of music as I was growing up.
Did you have brothers or sisters growing up?
I had an older brother who was 6 years older than I was.
Was he an influence on you musically at all?
Not at all. No, he had no desire to be involved in music. My mom was a piano teacher. She taught at the schools and she taught at home. And she had a baby grand in the living room. So I was constantly exposed to horrific piano players from a very young age. And, I'd hear them and I would escape to the basement where my record collection was, or I'd go upstairs and try and watch TV or something. But of course, back then, TVs were few and far between. So it was mostly radio and records.
When did you first become aware of either the recording process or the credits on records? And when did that start to register in your mind as who were these people involved in this record making?
Well, I was exposed to music early on because of the piano teaching stuff my mom did. And I started learning piano around 7 or 8 years old. And I was playing Chopin at 11 and doing recitals. And at that point in time in school, I was going to dances. They had turntables and they'd play records at some of the dances. So I was getting exposed to all kinds of music. Probably around 12 or 13, I was kind of becoming aware of music. And having played music and being involved in music, I started wondering, where was all this music coming from? And I would go up to the local music store and find the weekly lists on WKYC or WMMS. These were channels, AM channels in Cleveland. And you'd see the top 10 or the top 20. And you'd go in the record store and you'd check out these 45s that were, back then it was all mono, of course, and albums were mono as well. And I would go in every week and check out who was top 10 and music that was on the radio stations at the time. And that's kind of when I started thinking about, who these musicians were or where they came from. Watching Ed Sullivan, you'd always hear music. Then the Beatles came on. And the first performance of the Beatles, that was it for me. It was like, all right, I'm going to play guitar. It was such an amazing epiphany that piano is not my instrument. I want to learn to play guitar. And my uncles, who were in a big band, they were in a pretty famous big band that played the Midwest back in the 40s, 50s, even into the 60s, when I was old enough to really appreciate it. As a young kid, I got to go hear the big band play, and their lead singer was Dean Martin.
Oh.
And yeah, so at 7 years old, I got to go to the Holland Hotel and hear Dean Martin play with my uncle's band. It was the Sammy Watkins Orchestra. So, from early on, I was just totally enamored by live music.
This was before my time, but the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, that was pretty life-changing for a lot of people, I bet.
Yeah, it was for me. I know so many people who are probably my age or maybe a little older or a little younger, and seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan was everything. And, shortly after the Rolling Stones performed on Ed Sullivan, but the Beatles, there was something about their music. So, of course, up to the record store, buy every 45 that ever came out. She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand. And it was interesting. I was talking to Joel Sullivan, and he goes, you have any of those 45s? I said, yeah, I've still got my original Beatle 45s. And he goes, do you have the covers? I said, no, are you kidding? I had nails on the wall of my basement, And I had all my 45s on the walls. And I'd have parties down in my basement and people would come over and we'd all dance. And I'd have a turntable from early on and I'd be playing 45s. But it's funny because Joel goes, oh man, too bad. If you had those covers, those 45s would be worth some real money. Unfortunately, that was not the case. I didn't keep the 45 covers, but I still have all those original 45 Beatle records. I started teaching myself guitar. And then I started working at a music store, started taking guitar lessons at the same time I was working at the music store. It was called Dick Lurie Guitars. He was a famous jazz player. First jazz record I ever put out, I dedicated one of the songs to him that I had written because he was an inspiration as well.
So did you have designs on wanting to be a rock star, we'll say?
Everybody has dreams of thinking, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to play music and I'm going to play live. And I didn't really think about it that way, but I gravitated towards that. You know, school was important and studying and doing all that, but music did take over my life in a lot of different ways. And at 15 years old, I joined a band with a neighbor down the road. And the second band that I ended up playing in was called The Illusions. And they became one of the hottest bands in Cleveland, Ohio. And we played all the high schools and all the clubs. So at 15 or 16 years old, I was going into bars and playing in this band. We had quite a career in Cleveland all the way through to probably, I think, junior year in high school. And then that band kind of fell apart. But, you know, having had grown up in Cleveland and playing a lot of different clubs, there was something called the Cleveland Teen Fair in 1967. And the Illusions entered it, and the James Gang entered it. That's when I first met Joe Walsh. And we went through a series of performances, and the winners of these performances moved to the next step. And the next step was you got to play in the final concert competition for local bands. And the winner of the contest got a recording contract with Bill Simzik and CBS. So I'm 16 years old and I'm playing in this band, The Illusions. We had 2 horn players, bass, drums, guitar. I was the guitar player. And we had 2 singers. And we were doing songs like Magical Mystery Tour and My Girl. And so we were doing like R&B and we were doing rock and roll. And we were just a combination of all kinds of music, very eclectic band at 16 years old. And the James Gang were pure rock and roll. I mean, they were out of Kent State and they were rock and roll. In the end, the James Gang won the Cleveland Teen Fair and we came in second. That's how James Gang got their first recording contract. And my inspiration from that was to go towards rock and roll a little more as opposed to R&B, though my background was really an education in all kinds of music. And I got exposed to such amazing musicians at the time back in the late 60s as a kid. And I had another band that played a lot of the clubs in Cleveland after that as well. So, you know, it really did start in the music side of things. And my musical career continued all the way through when I was in college in pre-med and I was at Cleveland Institute of Music at the same time, double major. And music won out.
You were pre-med.
Yeah.
I'm curious about how your parents felt about music ruling out.
Well, you know, I grew up without a father. My dad died at 6 years old.
Okay.
So I grew up with a mom who was an amazing woman who was a musician herself and a piano teacher. She constantly fought me on the fact that she wanted me to continue my education in, finish pre-med, finish medical school. And unfortunately, really music was such a success in my life. You know, that's where I went. I went in the field of music. And I played music until probably, I'm still playing music.
I was going to say, you're still playing music.
Yeah, I'm still playing. I'm playing with Liz Kennedy. We've done 5 albums. We've just finished our 6th album. And we'll be doing some concerts coming up here pretty soon. And I play as a session player on a lot of people's music.
Well, let's talk about the recording side of things. When did that become a dominant part of your life? And what was your first exposure to recording?
I continued my music education in Tucson, Arizona, and I was going to school there. And I was playing music there at the same time. So as I continued school, I continued playing music. I guess it was about 73 or 74. I bought a TAC 3340 and started recording on 4-track. And I was composing and playing music. So that was my first experience in recording. And there was a local studio in Tucson at the time that I'd been to. They had a 16-track tape machine, and it was kind of my education to the world of recording, hands-on. But back in the 60s, I went into agency recording in Cleveland recording studios, and the band, The Illusions, recorded a couple singles in those studios. And the guys were wearing white lab coats, and, the knobs were huge potentiometers. And that was my first experience to recording studio, and it was overwhelming. Being the guitar player, I was just kind of in awe at what was going on. And these guys were really electricians. Audio recording as a field didn't really exist back then. I mean, audio recording came much later as far as schools that were starting to teach classes in audio recording. Everything was getting electronics information, having an education in electronics, and then continuing on from that into the audio field, if that's what you choose to do. So it's kind of one step after another. But it wasn't until probably 1980 when I had a record deal with a label out of Los Angeles, Jag Records. We had distribution lined up with RCA. Pat Aracey, who was the Jefferson Airplanes A&R guy, took an interest to us. And we were going to put out our first record through this independent label, but distributed to RCA. And Pat Aracey got fired. And we had done a complete record, had a single out. So it was one thing after another. Things fell apart because we lost our distribution deal. At that point in time, I was doing a lot of production work in the record plant in Sausalito at that time. I'd kind of moved to California, had a band on the coast with Jimmy Hodder from Steely Dan, a couple other musicians that I'd played with in Arizona, put this great band together called the Imaginary Band. And we played on the coast. We were kind of a real hot item in the mid-70s there. And then the Imaginary Band became Loge, and that was the band that I had signed my deal with. And at that point in time, it was like, I graduated from composing to working in the studios with some amazing engineers and producers. And working in the 70s at the record plant was very eye-opening. I had some amazing mentors. Dr. Richie Moore, who worked with Emmerich on the White Album, recorded all of Canned Heat's music, recorded Pablo Cruz. Dr. Richie Moore was an amazing man, and he was probably one of my number one mentors. He's no longer with us, has been gone for quite a while. He helped build Studio D Recording, my studio. He built a couple other rooms, was very involved in tuning rooms and helping people get their rooms together. And at one point in time, I think he was over at Wally Heider's or maybe Trace Virgo's at the time, and was hanging a microphone from the ceiling because he wanted to have a couple mics up in the ceiling for ambient sound, and fell off a ladder and broke the cochlea in his ear and became known as Dr. Mono. I'm not laughing because of what a terrible tragedy for someone that brilliant to lose one side of his hearing, but because everybody called him Dr. Mono. And Richie was a great guy, and Richie taught me more about multi-track machines and bias and all of the technical things that I didn't quite have a great understanding of until I met him. And I worked with him for years, and he built Studio D with me. He was very involved in the audio side and the acoustic side of Studio D recording, which happened because I lost my recording contract in 1981 and was working at the record plant at the time. I was doing themes for television shows. And at that point in time, I was working with Jeff Norman, great engineer who also learned a lot from, and Ricky Sanchez, who was an assistant who became our engineer for a while. So, it was really great to be a producer and a composer and work with all these guys because I just had such a great education. I started engineering a lot of my own stuff. And at that point in time, I was very frustrated with a lot of the rooms in the Bay Area because the rooms were very dead. All the rooms were such a closed kind of system that when you recorded in there, after the fact, you had to kind of add ambience and reverbs and things that, for me as a live player, I loved the sound of playing live outside or in a room that was alive. Mm-hmm. And the idea in our conversations were, let's build a live room. So myself and 3 other partners, Dan Godfrey, who is probably still one of my dearest friends and was my partner at Studio D Recording for the longest time. And Terry and Randy, one of them was the manager at the plant. The other one was an acoustician and an audio engineer. And the 4 of us started talking about, let's build a live room. Didn't happen until August of 83 that we found a space, which was about 4 blocks from the record plant. And at that point in time, the industry was going through a lot of changes. It was struggling.
What year was that?
Well, the year that we started building Studio D Recording was 1983.
Okay.
And we didn't open until August of 84. It took us a year to build Studio D Recording.
Did you build the building from the ground up?
One of the biggest mistakes, and we talked about the things you do wrong in your career and stuff, was that we rented a space. We had no concept of the idea that this was going to have a life of its own. And this studio was going to become kind of a focal point in the Bay Area because of the live recording studio, the live sound, the heart of rock and roll. People wanted to work in the live room. And we kind of started this rage that a lot of other people followed. So in August of 83, we rented a space in a big warehouse. And in September of 83, August of 84, we actually opened. The room was done. Took us a year to build it and a lot of money back then. We had a big party. We had spotlights out. We had all kinds of people from the entertainment industry, audio and acting. Robin Williams was there and a variety of other people, and the film festival people were there. And a lot of the audio people in the industry who I met over the years were invited. So we had a huge opening party. We opened and people were kind of really taken back by a live room. They were kind of going, oh my God, to listen to what a drum kit sounded like in that room, controllable but live, blew people's minds. Our first year was such an amazing year. We had a lot of success. We had a lot of people who came in because of the room. Faith No More was one of the first albums we did. There's so many albums that we've done that it's really hard for me to remember how many people actually performed there and recorded there. Pablo Cruz recorded there. As I said, Faith No More recorded there. I'm just thinking early on. In the 80s, after we opened, it was kind of one album after another. We did a couple of Huey Lewis albums. We did Soundgarden. Soundgarden was a great album that was done there. We did a variety of projects from the Seattle scene that came down to use the room. And it's a huge list. You can go online to studiodrecording.com and look at the artists that have been in there since the opening of the studio.
I wanted to ask you some of the early lessons that within the first 5 years of the studio opening, what lessons did you learn? What things were starting to come up that you thought, here's a problem, or this is working, this is not working? What's your recollection of that time period?
One of the first things we we recognized was that we needed more isolation, because for a live room, it was fabulous, especially for drums, for bass, for stringed instruments, for guitars. But to have everybody in the room was a very challenging situation. We spent a lot of time tuning the room acoustically, and we put these tunable systems up on the wall. The idea came from Capitol Studios A, which had these huge turnable systems that you could change the ambience in the room. Well, we did something very much like that, and we were able to tune the room so that we could tone it down. But what we realized, or what I realized, was that I needed to build a couple ISO booths. So having built a symmetrically perfect room with stereo imaging, I had to figure out how I was going to build 2 ISO booths in the room without changing the imaging. And we did. We built 2 rooms, one in the back corner of each side, that we were able to isolate instruments in. And we could put a Marshall amp in one and a bass amp in another, and have the cables come out in the room, and the players would be out in the room with the drummer. And we built a lot of gobos, roll around ISO panels, so that we could kind of separate off parts of it if we needed to isolate certain areas of the room. But the room was built with the best acoustics in mind. We built a decoupled floating slab in Studio D. We canted the back wall 3 degrees so that and the front would not be parallel in any way. We ended up putting a rolling 8-foot curve in the ceiling of Studio D to accentuate the low end. And that made a huge difference in the room as well. And it is a tight room, but a very live room. So, decay time is controllable. And Jerry Hay came in to do Earth, Wind, and Fire in our room. And after about 8 bars, dropped his baton and went, "This is the best sounding string room I've ever heard." He's doing strings at the time. And then we did horns there. And we got such great positive responses from people that the word spread, and Studio D had a life of its own. It's 40 years this year. Pretty amazing.
Where were the issues cropping up? Where were the hard lessons starting to appear that you all were addressing? Besides, the identification of acoustics, but business-wise, where were things starting to show cracks?
I think the expense of building a room like that and having a limited amount of space, but still needing a lounge, still needing an office, some of those things were things that kind of hit us as we were opening, going, man, we're kind of, we need more space, or we need to figure out how we're going to do these things. The original design worked really well because it gave us the ability to expand a little by having an upstairs. The studio itself takes up the whole space from about 40 feet into the space that we leased. And it's pretty amazing to think that in 1983, we leased the space for about $1,100 a month. And after the building was bought and sold 3 times, the cost of leasing the facility has gone up significantly. I mean, it's overwhelming. We kind of morphed as we realized that there were issues or things that we needed to do. One of the things was gear. We realized that we started with an older Trident A range that needed so much work. The cost of it and the downtime was prohibitive. Because it was a lease with an option, we got rid of that. Actually, the first console I ever had in there was a Trident Flexi Mix, because we didn't have the console yet. We made a mistake of thinking we were going to build a console. A couple of our partners really wanted to build a console, and it was a huge mistake. The design and the flaws of trying to use the front end of an A range and the rear end of a designed monitor section was a nightmare. It almost put us under. But we survived that, and we survived a few partner changes, and we survived going through 3 consoles. The one that lasted the longest during the early stages of Studio D recording was the Trident TSM. And the Trident TSM was a great rock and roll console. The plant had 2 of them back in the 80s. late 80s. We had the third one that I bought from David Rubinson from the Automat. So we bought that console, rebuilt it, and then put a Flying Fader automation system into it. I did so many records there and mixed so many records on that console. It was really a great console. But we realized that at that point in time, we wanted some better mic pre's. We wanted to expand the studio. And we eventually got rid of the Trident A range. And I made a decision that really did me in, which was I was talking to some people who were involved with Rupert Neve and AMS, not AMS, AMEC. And Rupert was hired to build a console. He did all the audio pathways for a console called the 9098i. There was a split console and there was an inline. And I went up to the Canadian Broadcast Company in Vancouver and worked on the split console, which did not have automation at the time. They were still working on the automation, and fell in love with Rupert's design. His audio pathways were unbelievable. I had interesting conversations with him to talk about how he chose to build this console and the preamps, some of his finest work ever. And I really feel blessed to have known Rupert and to have worked with him. So we ended up buying a 9098i, the inline, and I had all of these friends of mine who were peers of mine who wanted to work in the room. And the automation system was a bastardized automation system from their Angela, and it did not work. And we had issues one after another with the software and the recall system. And I ended up working with Gary Lamb, the programmer, becoming a beta tester for him. And I would explain to him why this thing kept failing and why you'd get halfway through a mix and you'd save constantly and it would crash and you'd lose everything that you did. And I had a couple really high-end engineers who I won't name at this moment in time, who are still good friends of mine, who couldn't work. They go, Joel, I can't work on this console. It's not working. It ended up turning into a very ugly situation. And for a year, I tried to keep the studio going and basically had some serious financial losses, property and other things, because I was leveraging myself trying to keep the studio going. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And it was the best tracking console I'd ever worked on. I realized that what I needed to do was start mixing in Pro Tools and not use the automation on the console because it just never worked.
Right.
And it was a fabulous console, but it just became cost prohibitive. And we lost so much work at that point in time that we ended up going into mediation. It was a very unsatisfying situation. We ended up telling them to come and get the console because after, a fortune and trying to make it work, it just didn't work.
It's interesting that a decision like that can almost wreck a studio.
Yeah. If it wasn't for my partner, Jeff Shea, I think Studio D wouldn't be here now because he really stood up and helped us get through that tough time. And then COVID hit. And that was my death knell. It was like, I'm out of the business. I, as a producer and an engineer, I am so much more appreciated and enjoy doing what I do than having to run a studio. And after almost 40 years, it was a situation where I just felt like I don't want to run a studio anymore. So, I kind of became an independent. I'm still involved very much, but my partner kind of took over the studio, and bless his soul that it's still there and it's had a rebirth and it's a great room and people love tracking there.
It is. I did a project there with Jerry Slavonia.
Oh, interesting.
He brought me in to do this thing that he had, and I played drums on it. And then it just disappeared, went nowhere. And out of nowhere, I'd say about 4 or 5 years ago, he finally pulled the tracks up and mixed it and put it out. And it was so strange to hear because I was so much younger when that was recorded.
Do you remember when it was?
I don't. I mean, it had to have been in the early 90s.
Very good.
But it just, hearing it transported me to Studio D. I'm derailing you. What I wanted to say was, you've talked about some partners, and no disrespect to your partners, but your name is the only name I have always associated with Studio D since I've been in the Bay Area since 1988. And your decision to step aside, I'm sure, was not an easy one.
No, it was right after COVID. It was right after COVID that I started thinking about, and by the way, kudos to you for that opening line in your podcast about get away from the chair. Because after so many years of being an engineer and a producer and sitting in that room, which I love dearly, it's like my home away from home, I realized that there are other things that were necessary. When I started that studio, I had a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old. And and I think about their life and growing up. And they loved coming to the studio. They loved having Huey Lewis sing happy birthday to them on the phone and, little things like that. But the reality was, man, there was so much time that I spent in the studio that I could have maybe been doing other things or enjoying life a little more. And after COVID, I realized that as older that I get, I realize that, everybody's got an expiration date. And the reality is that I needed to find time to be able to enjoy life, put energy into myself, and yet at the same time, do what I love to do, which is help people realize their dreams, produce music and record music. And I look at my discography and it kind of amazes me, the people that I've worked with, and feel very lucky to do that. But it was a tough decision, one based on financial and one based on health and one based on time. And I decided that I couldn't run the studio anymore. And my partners asked me twice to run the studio, and I just can't do it, Tell
me if you agree with me on this. Your time running a studio, and I'm just saying, like, our time, like what we all decide to do. Those of us who decide to get
you
involved
ran a
in
studio.
Yeah. We get kind of bullish and we get blinders on and we can't see anything else going on because we're so like caught up in the success of that studio. And then life slips by a bit. Do you think that that's an accurate statement for you?
I totally do, Matt. I really do. I look at how old I was when I started the studio and how old I am now. And I'm going, okay, well, that was my life, or that was the majority of my life, was the fact that I've lived in a studio for 40 years. It's been 40 years this year. And hopefully we'll have a good party celebrating 40 years at Studio D recording. But I realized that there's more to life than getting up every morning and going to the studio and living that dream and constantly looking for work, constantly trying to bring things in. There were periods of time where we had people fighting over wanting to get into the studio. And that's not the way it is anymore. I mean, with the advent of home recording and people doing a lot of the work at home, wanting to either bring it in and mix it or wanting to track and then take it home and work on it themselves, and then maybe bring back a mess and go, can you mix this for me? There's all different ways of looking at it, but the reality is it's not a complete process anymore. It's a very fragmented process. And I don't have a problem with that. It's the nature of the industry right now. It's kind of like what's happened to artists and royalties and the streaming situation. And it's just awful the way the industry has damaged, songwriters and composers and musicians. And, I've had some very well-known people tell me we don't sell records anymore. The only way we sell records is when we tour. We tour and we sell our records live, CDs or albums at our concerts. But, we don't make money off of record sales anymore, and streaming is a joke. the amount of money that people make streaming. Why do you think so many artists are living on the road? Look at Taylor Swift. There's a good example. Even though she probably streams millions of streams on her songs, you get paid so little for what you're streaming. It's awful. It's terrible. I mean, there should definitely be more work done by the Academy, and there is work being done by the Academy to correct the wrongs, just like AI is something that really worries people.
Yeah. I feel that change is always there for every industry. And I think the challenge is you have to you have to embrace it, because if people who made buggy whips protested against, the advancement of the gas powered car, I mean, it's a battle you cannot fight effectively once the genie is out of the bottle.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say about the current state of things, because I feel like, what are you going to do? Like, you can't stop progress.
You can't go back.
You can't. I mean,
that's very funny. I was thinking, I produced a record for Eddie Money when you were talking about Eddie Money in one of your podcasts, and Randy Forrester and I produced a record for Eddie Money, and it was a great record, and it was called "Wanna Go Back," and it's really funny because it was all the songs that he grew up with that he loved, and he loved that time. And he was thinking about his life now, and that's henceforth how the album title came. And he actually had his daughter sing on a couple of the tracks. And it's true. You can't go back. You may want to go back, but you can't. And I don't know that I would change anything, because I really love where my life has taken me. It's a long and winding road.
Yeah.
And it is very important, though, to get out of the chair. And that's the answer to the question that you gave me about running the studio and kind of making that decision to get away from it. I'm glad it's still there. I'm glad that I'm engineering and producing in multiple places, and love going back to tracking at Studio D. I just did the last two projects I did at Studio D were so amazing. One was a classic rock band called Soul Twin Messiah. And these guys have such a great message, and their music is so classic rock. We did a Dolby Atmos version of the album, as well as the stereo version. And it was submitted for a Grammy this year in the immersive category and in the classic rock category. And it was such a blast to do classic rock in Atmos. And the second project that I did right after that in the last couple of years was a 12-piece gospel rock band that is just amazing. This band has kind of come together and is such a unique band. And we worked on the album at Studio D. Then I mixed it on a different platform up in Reading with Mark Cooper, who's the musical director of the band. And the video director who came in to do the video for the single on this 12-piece gospel rock band said, "You guys are such a kick. You should do a reality show on your band and the creation of what you guys do." And they shot an episode at my studio, the first episode, and they presented it. And there are 3 networks that are bidding on who's going to get the reality show.
Oh,
so
interesting.
So talk about interesting things. In reality, getting away from one role and going to another role is a good thing. And I think that it really makes a difference in your life to not be closed-minded to one thing.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. When you made the decision to step away from the studio, did that include the decision to step away financially, to just walk away from that?
Well, I don't have the financial burden anymore. That is correct.
When that ceased to exist, did you feel like you had a great relief, a great albatross off your shoulders?
That's an understatement. Yeah. Honestly, Matt, the stress of that was killing me, and I made that decision because I needed to do it for my health. And we don't have to talk about how old we are, but I have to say I'm dealing with some health issues that I never had dealt with or thought I would be dealing with. I've been healthy all my life, but now all of a sudden I've got health issues. I think just getting old, that's part of the game. But what you say from God's ears to your mouth about stepping away and being active and putting energy into your life is a really important thing. It's also very important to put 1,000% into anything you do in your audio field. And that's kind of what I feel about audio is whether I'm playing the guitar or whether I'm working as an engineer producer, it's really important to focus and put your complete self into whatever you're doing. When you're not doing that, you can do other things. But when you're there, you got to be there completely, or you're not doing yourself or your client a service.
So these days, you're freelance. You have no barriers, nothing holding you back. You can go and do whatever you want, whenever you want. Is that accurate?
That's very funny. Yes. That is definitely the case. And I'll probably be working till the day I fall over because I'm not one of those artists who made a lot of money early on. I spent all my money on keeping a studio going, and COVID really did, really hurt. That really was a very difficult time.
Yeah.
Glad I'm past that. And you're right. As an independent, I have the pleasure to be able to say yes or no if I want to do a project or I don't want to do a project, right?
Yeah. Based on your experience, which is extensive, let's say there's an up and coming engineer producer. What would you tell them now based on what you know? In other words, what mistakes to avoid and what situations to take an interest in or take advantage of?
I think as an upcoming engineer producer, it's really important to keep yourself open to all options, number one. Number two, to be open to trying new things. It's as an old dog, it's hard to do new tricks, but, I think it's really important to stay open to things. I love working with my assistant who's becoming a brilliant engineer and has been working at Studio D. And I always love hearing assistants that I work with, what their thoughts are or how they look at things. And I think it's really interesting that it's important that you're open to trying new things. I think, it's great when you get a sound and you keep to that sound, like Clear Mountain or like who are the two brothers that
the Lord Alge brothers.
Yeah, exactly. And they've got sounds. And someone said, you go in a room and he's got all his gear set one certain way for certain things, each piece of gear. I've never been in his room, but I think that's great. And I understand that. And I think that works for him. But when you have guys who are working all over the place, you have to have an ear. You got to be open to listening. And I tell people, use your ears. It's like, don't just do things because, this is the way to do it. It's like, use your ears, use your mind. That's what's going to really bring you into a creative world and have a musical background. Take the time to really learn about music, because my musical knowledge has helped artists so much in their creativity and what they want to do by having that musical knowledge to be able to impart something to them if they're having issues or they're not sure where they want to go. Not so much on the technical side as an engineer, but on the side of a production value, but also on the engineering side. If you don't use your ears, you're really not going to get the best sound. What blew my mind with Rupert Neve, Rupert would tell me that he would go to Japan and the Japanese would play different samples for him and say, what do you think about the sound of this? Or what do you think about the sound of this? And they'd play them like 48K stuff or 44.1 or 96 or 192. And they would always be blown away because Rupert would go, well, that's obviously, high sample rate of 96K or that's 192. The fact that, he used his ears until he was no longer with us. I mean, that man understood sound, and as well as the technical side, he understood you got to listen. That's my message to these new people who are coming up is use your ears, use your brain, be open to different things.
What would you tell somebody also coming up? What are the lessons that you learned about money in the world of audio and record making or running a studio?
Well, those are two completely different things,
Okay.
Honestly, the issue with money in studios is that you have to be aware that depending upon the market you're in, you have what people consider to be the market price for a studio like your own or another room. And I just think you have sliding scales in some respect. I think that your book rates and your work with film should be one thing. If you, as an owner, operator, want to help someone, then you have to make that decision as to whether you can afford to do something at a price that a person can afford to pay. Do you want to work with them or not? These are just things that, as a studio owner, you have to be aware of. There are a lot of studio owners, especially in major areas like New York and Los Angeles, where they know what they need to make in order to keep their studio going and keep their employees happy. And those are the rates that they charge. And the people who go in there are usually the people who can afford that. There's a fine line that we walk in that regard as a studio owner and as a producer as well. You have to decide what you can afford to work for in order to be able to live, and yet at the same time give someone a situation financially that they can afford and take advantage of your expertise. People work with me because they like the way I listen, the way I work, and that I can work with them at a rate that they feel comfortable with. But they expect to get the best that I can give them at whatever rate they're working. So you have to be aware of that. You have to come to terms with it yourself. You can't charge someone very little money and then do a shit job. It's a reflection on you. So you have to come to terms with how to balance all of those things. I hope that answers your question. It's a tough one, man.
Yeah, I get it. But I'm sure it's so much easier to, like, if an artist comes to you and you have a studio, obviously you're going to try to drive them to that studio. But if you're freelance, you can look at the landscape and say, okay, for this budget, I need to make this much. Therefore, we're going to go work over here. So in some respects, the studio, while it has its advantages of having your own studio, it can put you at a disadvantage too, based on how that studio is structured.
Very much so. Very much so. And, I always, when it comes to a major project, I always try and go to the room that I'm most familiar with and that I love dearly. At the same time, I have my own independent room for when I need to do things that people can't afford to go to Studio D or afford to do things in a room they want to work in. I encourage people to work wherever they want to work so that they feel comfortable doing it. At the same time, depending upon what the project is, you can be flexible.
Yeah. Do you ever think, looking back, do you ever think I should have moved to Los Angeles?
God, that's funny you say that. Al Schmidt and Ed Cherney were good friends of mine. We were all in the Music Producers Guild. I don't know if you remember that. This was before the producers wing of the Grammys. There was the Music Producers Guild, and we were all involved. And that's kind of how I became friends with them. And we'd done some panels together that the Grammy organization had asked us to do on surround, actually. And Ed and Al were trying to put a label together, and the first act that they wanted to sign was the group that I did called Summit. And it was George Brooks on sax and Zakir Hussain and Fareed Hawk, a couple other musicians that their names don't come to me at the moment. Forgive me for that. But anyway, they wanted to sign the group. They approached me and were going to sign us, and their deal fell apart. And the funding for their label fell apart, and it didn't happen. And it's unfortunate. The record came out independently, and it's a fabulous record. In answer to you, that sidebar is the reason I answered starting with that, because Al and Ed said, "What the hell are you doing up in Northern California? Why aren't you living in Los Angeles?" Al, for one, kept saying, "You should move down to Los Angeles, man. You could be working all the time." God rest his soul. What an amazing man. Just wonderful conversations with him. And I thought that, and my response to them was, what would happen to Studio D? I mean, I kind of was the seed for that studio and that creation of my life, of living there and working there and everything. It's like, okay, what am I going to do? Just up and leave? And that was the question. They asked me, why aren't you working in Los Angeles? And it isn't a regret, but I do think about that a lot. I think I would have had a very interesting life working down there, knowing Paula and knowing Ed's, knowing Rose and all these people, and Karen Pinniger. These were all women who were running studios at the time. I know that I would have been very happy down there and would have enjoyed it, but I never really liked Los Angeles. I loved being up here in Marin County in San Francisco, and I raised my kids up here, and I just, I love it up here. So
yeah, it's funny. I mean, I do love Los Angeles, and I love the people down there, but there's something magical about being up here. We may not have the center of the world industry of recording and music happening up here anymore. We used to be a great hub.
Yeah.
I do not think we're a great hub anymore, but still, the community we have up here it's pretty cool. It's kind of a small community, and we all kind of, our degrees of separation are minimal.
I agree with you completely. I really, really am fond of our music community up here. And I love all the studio owners and the guys who are engineer producers. And I feel, sometimes I don't, but I feel like I'm a part of it. And sometimes you have that feeling where you're isolated and you're not, but at the same time, I feel honored to be part of it, in whatever way that is.
Well, we are out of time, Joel. I'm really grateful to you for doing this, because you're part of the Bay Area history here, and it would be a crime to not get you on the show and have you be a part of it. So thank you so much for making the time for me.
Matt, my extreme pleasure. I am really glad that we got to do this. Really great to be a part of this. Thank you for that. And I hope that my history and any information I've been able to give you will benefit some people who get you to listen to the program.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And by the way, I love your podcast, man. I really do.
Thank you.
I just think it's a great podcast. If anybody's interested, they can go to AllMusic or my Wikipedia page or Studio D Recording and learn more about the history of my career and that. But I think we touched on a lot of it.
I'll put a link in the show notes for the audience, and they'll be able to check that out. Joel, you stay right there because we're going to do some housekeeping, but thank you again, and you take care.